I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. Together with my colleague at KU Leuven, Professor Andrea Robilio, we bring you these lectures on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness in fall 2014. This is the first video for class number 9. Class number 9 concerns Thomas Aquinas' earliest consideration of ultimate human happiness. Video 9a will consist of preliminary remarks on philosophical sources that were used by Aquinas. We want to distinguish what was actually said in those sources, and then next video, video 9b, will focus right in on Aquinas and his understanding of these. But for the most part, I want to look at the sources that he's looking at. As you know from your reading of the assigned material, the translation of this text that's available, and also my article on this in the Thomist from 2012, that this is extremely important for Aquinas, and this notion of ultimate human happiness, of course, is central to Christian teaching. And what we're going to look at then is his discussion of this in the commentary on the sentences, and this piece was written about 1254. So let's proceed then. Our focus then is, as I said, on the commentary on the sentences, and in particular Book 4, Distinction 49, Question 2, Article 1, hereafter I'll abbreviate it as in for sent D49 Q2, Article 1, A1, which concerns whether the blessed will see God in his essence. Now, this title should be kept in mind here, since Aquinas will draw deeply from the philosophers of the Greek and Arabic traditions who discuss the notion of highest intellectual understanding as fulfillment and happiness, sometimes regarding the present life and sometimes regarding the afterlife. But for Aquinas, it's not possible to see God in this life, and whatever see God means, of course, we have to get to that. It's not possible, though, in this life, whereas for some of these philosophers, as we'll see, that is, it does seem possible to have highest intellectual happiness. For not all of them does this mean seeing God face to face, as we'll see. Let's go back to Al-Farabi then, whom we studied earlier. You'll recall from the previous video on Al-Farabi, he wrote that the meaning of the afterlife is the full attainment of the immaterial acquired intellect which no longer requires a body. Does he mean for it to be something that comes about in earthly life or only after death? It's an interesting question, and I don't have an easy answer on this. It seems as though it's something that can happen to human beings in this life, but when one ponders that a bit, it seems rather odd as well that such a thing could happen. I mean, are there actual human beings who Al-Farabi has met, perhaps, who could become immaterial and no longer require a body in this life? It's an interesting question, which is not going to be answered here. You'll recall then from the Al-Farabi video, that much of my explanation of his teachings was drawn from his treatise on the intellect, his political regime, and his perfect state. These works, these latter two works, were not available in Latin translation at the time of Aquinas. The treatise on the intellect was available in Latin, but we have no clear evidence of its use by Aquinas. What we do know, though, is that the understanding of Al-Farabi on the nature of the human soul or intellect, Aquinas relied almost solely on the long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle for that. What's more, the long commentary on the De Anima by Averroes appears to have been the sole source used by Aquinas for the thought of the philosophers discussed in this in the fourth book of the sentences, Distinction 49, Question 2, Article 1, with the exception of Avicenna, whose metaphysics and De Anima Aquinas consulted separately. His discussion is not dependent upon Averroes for that. Now, regarding Avicenna, in his De Anima, which was translated into Latin in the 12th century, and so had been available for quite some time, it was one of the primary texts studied in philosophy. For Avicenna, conjoining with the agent intellect begins in earthly life, where a conjoining or emanative connection is required for the formation of human intellectual understanding of intelligibles in act. The philosopher or prophet, according to Avicenna, may be able to conjoin during earthly life, But the end or goal of earthly life is to prepare the immortal rational soul for the afterlife. And that afterlife will be one of the rational soul. We want to stress that, the immaterial rational soul. A sign of conjoining here in this life is, for Avicenna, the quick apprehension of the middle term needed for demonstration. This is something that very few people, a very small number of people are able to have with extraordinary quickness, and something that's also available to prophets. That afterlife for Avicenna is of a purely immaterial rational soul conjoining and knowing the agent intellect and all the intelligibles in it. Of course, in varying degrees, in accord with the preparation of the rational soul of each during earthly existence in the body. Some of you may recall that in Plato and the Republic, the dead would choose new lives to live on the basis of the knowledge they acquired in the world, and if those choices were bad, then they would have a bad life. But after they make the choice on the basis of knowledge that they had, they would drink of the river of forgetfulness, and and then start all over again in life. The emphasis for Plato then was it's very important during the present life for us to make the very best of our education and to develop ourselves into philosophers if possible. The same thing is here in Avicenna. The very best thing we can do is develop ourselves while here in the body to be as full with regard to our rational soul and intellectual understanding and knowledge as possible, so that we may have a better life. In one work, he writes that it seems that some people may have developed themselves so little that they believe they're asleep in the next life, because they have no understanding of the life of the intellect, which is what the human soul essentially is, a rational soul, a rational immaterial soul. In the case of Averroes, who was extremely important, and as I just said, is the major source for Aquinas in this article of the Commentary on the Sentences, we have already seen that Averroes wrote 3 commentaries on the De Anima of Aristotle. A short commentary with important issues and questions discussed, a middle commentary of a paraphrasing sort, but with a new doctrine on the nature of the human soul and intellect, and the famous long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle, which was written apparently in 1186, and is the first of his long commentaries on Aristotle. He also wrote long commentaries on the metaphysics, the posture analytics, the De Caelo, and the physics. Of those, the posture analytics commentary was not translated at the time of Aquinas or in the Middle Ages, but rather there's a Renaissance translation of that. So this work on the De Anima was a third attempt to form a coherent account of the doctrine of intellect. This last encounter then, in 1186, draws deeply on the Greek and Arabic traditions in an attempt to complete Aristotle's very, very rich, but nevertheless sparse account of the principles of human understanding. Aristotle put many principles forward, but that seemed to be essential, but never gave us a full account. And I think, as you know, I've spoken of the importance of those last lines of De Anima 3:7, that is Book 3, Chapter 7, where Aristotle, according to some, is talking about mathematics, but according to others, is talking about the knowledge of separate substances. And he says there, paraphrasing, he says that it's not clear whether while in life here we are able to see separate things, we are able to know separate things. And the tradition took that to be a question about knowing separate substances. And of course, knowing separate substances is the highest kind of understanding that we can have, because the separate substances are the causes of the universe. And Aristotle indicated this in Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapters 1 and 2. And also he seems to be saying something similar, or at least certainly relevant, in Metaphysics, Book 2. So this last encounter then, again, that's the same phraseology here, draws on the Greek and Arabic traditions in an attempt to complete Aristotle's account. It's this is in this last version of the long commentary. that was available to Aquinas and others thanks to the translation work of Michael Scott. And it became available around 1225. Michael Scott, who was probably working at the court of Frederick II in Sicily when he was doing these translations. Scott also worked in Toledo and elsewhere as well, but the likelihood seems to be strong that he was in Sicily at the court of Frederick II when he was doing that translation, and others. I've argued elsewhere that in each of his three commentaries, Averroes allows no room for any post-mortem existence for human beings. In this, Averroes charts a very different course from that of his predecessors Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Avicenna, as Averroes seeks to return to the true meaning of Aristotle's thought, free of accretions from Neoplatonism and religious or theological issues. This is very important to know because if there is no afterlife, we certainly can't talk about ultimate happiness being involved in something greater in the afterlife. In his thinking on the nature of the human soul, Averroes highlights the assertion of Aristotle at De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 2, 413b 25 to 27, that mind or intellect, the term is nous in Greek, seems to be a different kind of soul from the kind of soul that exists only in a body. This is something that Averroes jumps on immediately, because this is so important for Averroes, because that other kind of soul that is mind or intellect, well, he's going to take that as a completely different kind of soul here, and one that cannot be in the human being except in an equivocal way as a kind of intrinsic formal cause, which I'll talk about shortly. That and other considerations, among them, as we've already discussed in these videos, the unity of all intelligibles in a single collection, the requirement of an immaterial receptive subject, the material intellect shared by all, and more considerations, those prompted his assertion of the doctrine of the separate material intellect and the separate agent intellect. Human mortality is a consequence of the teaching that human thought takes place in the individual only by a conjoining with separate intellects, for abstraction, the agent intellect, and the retention of immaterial intelligibles, the material intellect. So what I'm trying to show is that the various principles that Averroes uses here constructs a fairly coherent account of human understanding, even if it goes in directions that someone such as Aquinas would find quite objectionable, and that I think Al-Farabi and Avicenna would find quite objectionable too, namely that individual human beings, on his account, are perishable. The views of Averroes are also supported by Aristotle's remarks in De Anima 3.5, you'll recall, where Aristotle says that there are active and receptive parts of intellect, and that these are in the soul. The Greek is ente suke. In the same chapter, Aristotle seems to indicate that the active part alone is immortal. This Averroes expands on with reasoning on the need for the immaterial subject for the reception of intelligibles in act. This is something we've discussed earlier. On his view, as Aquinas sees it, the rational soul needs enhancements from outside for its fulfillment in knowing to take place. For the sake of abstraction, the agent intellect then in some way supervenes and enhances the brain powers of the individual human to make it able to share in intellectual knowing. That is, the agent intellect becomes form for us. An important phrase. Form for us, enhancing natural powers by being in the soul, along with the material intellect, in a way that allows the perishable individual to have intellectual understanding for a time. Let me pause a little bit on this notion of form for us and give a further explanation. One of the meanings of form, and I believe I may have mentioned this earlier in one of the videos, one of the meanings of form is fulfillment or perfection. And in some cases, the form, when the reference to form means reference to actuality. And reference to matter is a reference to potentiality. So the terms form and matter can be used in equivocal senses or analogical senses to indicate what is perfectible and what is perfecting. And we need to keep an eye on that for what comes later on. Let me continue. The notion of the agent intellect being formed for us, with this notion, Averroes found, this is a notion that Averroes found in Alexander of Aphrodisias and also in Themistius. It is also in Al-Farabi as well. In Alexander, it was the notion that the agent intellect, which Alexander identified with God, the notion that the agent intellect supervened upon the human soul in order to complete human understanding of intelligibles and act. Explaining his understanding of Aristotle's reasoning in De Anima 3.5, Alexander held that individual human beings are perishable, but the agent intellect can help with regard to abstraction, and it does so by supervening upon the individual human being in there and bringing about the abstraction. Alexander was not as concerned about the issue of the immaterial subject for understood intelligibles as was Averroes. Instead, as Averroes understands him, he held the receptive material intellect to be a disposition, but not a subject as such. This the mature Averroes thought made no sense whatsoever. But that was the mature Averroes. When he was younger, he thought it made a great deal of sense. When Averroes was younger, namely at the time of the short commentary on the De Anima, and also, as I mentioned in my previous week's video, in an addendum, this is the same time as the commentary on the Parva Naturalia by Averroes, which has that rather distinctive account of epistemology. So when Averroes was younger and under the influence of Ibn Bajjah, he himself did hold something similar, namely the notion that the material intellect is a name for a disposition of images in the imagination, not the name of a substance or a subject as such. This is something discussed in earlier videos. The mature Averroes, however, insists on there being an immaterial subject for the reception of the abstracted intelligibles in act, and that this subject must be one for all human beings, as we've seen several times now. I've shown in 2 articles that the notion of form for us is found in all 3 commentaries by Averroes, and that the use of it by Aquinas is central to Aquinas' own teaching. Those articles are these: Intellect as Intrinsic Formal Cause in the Soul, according to Aquinas and Averroes, and you have the complete reference here. And then also an earlier article, The Agent Intellect as Form for Us, and Averroes' Critique of Al-Farabi. So those are 2009, 2005, and they're directly relevant to this issue. This notion then, found also in Al-Farabi, as I said, was taken over by Aquinas from his reading of Averroes' long commentary on the De Anima. But the notion of form for us was given very different meanings regarding natural epistemology, in contrast to what we see in the discussion of the supernatural epistemology of ultimate human happiness or beatitude, in seeing or knowing God face to face or in his essence, per essentiam. So what Aquinas will do, as we'll see in the next video, what Aquinas will do is take over this notion of form for us and put it to use in his understanding of supernatural epistemology. But with regard to natural epistemology, he attacks this view considerably, and many times throughout his life. And the article that's mentioned in the previous page, the first one on intrinsic formal cause, discusses nearly all of the passages in which Aquinas uses this notion of intrinsic formal cause to attack Averroes. So as I say here, later Aquinas would argue that the agent of possible or material intellects must be intrinsic powers of the individual human immaterial soul, rejecting the separate intellects of Averroes. And he argues then that these must be this agent intellect must be an intrinsic formal cause in us. On his side, however, Averroes earlier reasoned that humans clearly have knowledge and science, but this requires that the agent intellect and material intellect be in some way or another intrinsic to the soul as form. If it were not, then it wouldn't be ourselves knowing or doing the activity of knowing. So Averroes insisted that the 2 intellects had to be in us and the agent intellect as form for us. In this way, otherwise we would not be acting. And I believe we've already seen several passages where Averroes talks about doing this activity of knowing by our will or in a voluntary fashion. At any rate, for a detailed account of the reasoning of Averroes on this, and the twist that Aquinas makes to it, and the many places that Aquinas refers to this doctrine and attempts to refute Averroes, take a look at my article on intrinsic formal cause cited in the previous slide. All right, we're just about done with our preliminary remarks here, and just about done with this video. An English translation of the text that I made, my English translation, is available at this website. This is the website run by the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., across the street from Catholic University of America. And they took over my translation from another site and made it available there. There have been studies of this important text, many of which are cited in my article that's been assigned for this class, namely Aquinas and the Arabs, Arabic Islamic Philosophy, and Thomas Aquinas' conception of the beatific vision in his commentary on the sentences, etc., in the Thomas from 2012. For this video, and also for video 9b, I draw on our earlier work in the course, and also on the analyses in this article from the Thomist. But for now, let's stop here and proceed to consideration of the teachings of Aquinas in the commentary on the sentences, book 4, distinction 49, question 2, article 1, in video 9b. And I'll see you there.